morning, everyone, and welcome to the CBI at 10. The CBI at 10 for those people trying to make sense of, let's face it, quite a busy fortnight in politics, and one at which Tony Danker, the Director General of the CBI, you can't complain that business hasn't been at the front of minds of both Labour and the Conservative Party. Certainly it's been a fair bit of attention. We're joined by Torsten Bell, who runs the Resolution Foundation, Sonia Khan, the former advisor to the Chancellor. I'm going to come to Torsten and Sonia too in a moment, but I really thought this would be a chance, Tony, to try and digest, starting with the last few days, the way in which the government is thinking the future shape of the economy and the way in which it sees the role of business. I hope that everyone on the call knows the format of this, which is please do weigh in if you've got a thought, if you've got a question, put it in the chat and I'll try and bring those points into the conversation too. But Tony, what do you make of, let's start with what you've heard in the last, let's say, 72 hours.
You and I have used a phrase for these moments before, James, which is peak politics. And so word up for all the members out there, these were 2 weeks of peak politics. And so what I've been trying to do, what the CBI has been trying to do, is to not get too caught up in peak politics, is not to respond to the trap set by some that, you know, there's an argument here and business is on the wrong side of it, mainlining Labour, etc., etc. And just to let peak politics pass, and there's some very big economics and some very big implications for business we should all think about. But look, reflections on the last 72 hours in particular, the government's had a really hard month. There's been a lot of questions about competence in response to crises. Wednesday, the Prime Minister's speech day was also the day universal credit £20 uplift came to an end. And so we had a pretty big and bolsterous response. But, you know, the position we've taken, and for those of you that missed it, the Prime Minister made a big push around the need for higher wages, a big push for business to solve all these problems, in the context of saying that he wanted a high wage, high skill, high investment, high productivity economy, and that business should stop asking for the lever of uncontrolled immigration. So one I agree with, the second I don't. So just on the lever of uncontrolled immigration, if ever such a thing existed, which I don't think it ever did, I honestly don't know a business person in the country who believes we should pull such a lever. Right? We have an immigration system which is evidence-driven about the skills the economy needs, and I agree with the Conservative policy that we should let in only the skills that the country needs. We have a migration advisory committee who make recommendations about missing skills in the economy that the immigration system should respond to. There is a certain irony that last September, the migration advisory committee warned the government we didn't have enough butchers, and the government rejected that and didn't put butchers on the skilled immigration list. And here we are worried about Christmas. But I think, look, nobody disagrees about uncontrolled immigration. I think there's a really important question to have about short-term and long-term adjustment to the labour market to build the skills we need over time. And I've said it several times, you know, you don't turn baggage handlers into butchers, not overnight, probably not in a year or two. In a 5 to 10 year window, of course you do. And if we can develop a skills system in this country that incentivizes skills for shortages and long-term needs, then boy, we'll have a great answer. But the bigger question is this idea of a high wage, high skill, high investment, high productivity economy. And I and every member I've spoken to in the last 72 hours totally agrees with that vision. The risk we have is that actually what's going up? Wages are going up, prices are going up, taxes are going up. What's not going up are skill levels, investment levels, productivity levels. So what we really need to complete that vision the Prime Minister describes is real action on skills, investment, and productivity. We didn't get that this week because we were in peak politics, but we've got a budget and a spending review and many important milestones coming up in the weeks ahead. And so I'm really hopeful, actually, that we'll get a bit more detail from the government about how to deliver that complete vision.
I mean, in many ways, Tony, as you say, if you get away from the short-term politics of it, you know, two very big things have happened. One is that economics has returned to the center stage of politics, more than identity, more than cultural wars, more than even democratic arguments over taking back control. It is about the shape of the UK economy. And as you say, it is around the inputs into that economy that, is sort of front of mind for the CBI. Skills, investment, and changing that productivity dynamic. I suppose the question then is, what can you do that does inform the budget, that does inform the CSR? What comes out of this that means that, because the critique, of course, is it's a great vision, it's not a plan. How does the CBI turn it into a plan?
Yeah, well, look, I hope you're right. I hope what we're going to get into is economics and rather than politics, and not culture war. It was really interesting that the three biggest vocal opponents of the Prime Minister's speech and approach have been the country's leading pro-Brexit business people. So I think there is a little bit of politics going on, and I'm just going to avoid all of that if I may. As for, as you say, the big issue, which is how are we going, we have said we think business investment is going to come back after the pandemic 5% down. And we were already amongst the worst in the world on business investment. I think the Chancellor gets that argument. He and I had many conversations before the last budget, and he made a really bold play for what is a pretty conservative institution, Her Majesty's Treasury, with his super deduction. And the super deduction absolutely embraced the idea that to solve perennial decades of underinvestment in Britain, we needed to try radically new approaches to unlocking business investment. So I think he was right about that. And the super deduction's been highly effective for those admittedly small number of firms for whom it applies. So I think we should continue that spirit. And that's very much at the heart of our spending review and budget submission, is to continue that spirit. I spoke to the Chancellor about it at dinner on Monday night, and I intend to speak to him a few more times before the budget. And I think there's, you have to work both sides of the ledger. I'm sure Torsten will come on to this, as will Sonia. The idea that if we just raise wages overnight, a whole set of great things happen and investment goes up and productivity goes up. It just doesn't play that way. You have to work both sides of the ledger. So I think if we can match wage growth with real investment incentive, we might be on to something, but you can't do one without the other, because all you get is higher prices, et cetera, et cetera.
And what about the skills question? I mean, I'm struck by the fact that, at the annual conference last year, Keir Starmer came and said that was the number one issue, skills. Now you've got, the Prime Minister saying skills. And the truth is, people have been saying it for a decade. And what makes it go from a word to as I said, to a plan?
Well, look, I had breakfast yesterday with Nadeem Zahawi, and I think it's really super he's in post. You've got at the Department for Education, you've got somebody who really understands business, has come from a Bayes background. I think that's really a big opportunity. This is my sort of fundamental critique about current UK skills policy, and there's lots to discuss here. But the two things UK skills policy I don't think is targeted at today is, number one, tackling these short-term shortages, right? We don't have a skills policy that's trying to solve these problems, right? We just don't. I've got loads of employers, there'll be some on this call, who would love to use their apprenticeship levy money to go after really rapid training to solve current skills shortages. You can't. And secondly, we don't have a skills policy as yet that's really building the skills of the future growth engines of the economy, right? We're wanting still on digital skills. We're getting nowhere really on building green skills. My favorite anecdote, I may have shared it with you before, I did a round table of members in the Midlands a couple of months ago, and one FE college told us that they'd put up a course on EV maintenance, and they had very little sign up. And according to their incentive structure, they therefore had to kill that course and go back to doing courses on stuff that, frankly, is not going to solve the short or the long term of our economy. So there's a hell of a lot of work to do on skills. And by the way, it's not just on the government, right? As the CBI always says, 90% of people in the workplace today will need retraining in the next 10 years. And we have a really nice policy, the lifelong learning entitlement the government's introducing in their white paper, but it doesn't come into 2025. So, look, I think there's a huge lift to come on skills policy.
And just out of interest, Tony, for example, on the apprenticeship levy, because that's been knocking around for a while, when you raise that with someone like Nadeem, does he say, yes, I get it, we think we're going to be able to broaden its usage, or are they?
Look, I think everybody in government's view on the apprenticeship levy is that we're not changing it. right? It's going to exist. Stop saying for it to be scrapped. It's not going to be scrapped. But if you've got ideas on how to bend it, make it more flexible in order to solve some of these needs, we're all ears. But you must not compromise on quality. So in fairness to the government, their concern is that for years apprenticeships were low quality, and they want to sort of benchmark and accredit the quality of apprenticeships. The problem is that has just turned into a rather cumbersome regime, which means that levy gets unspent. The Treasury will be happy with that because it's money in the bank, but it's not really a serious skills economy for either the short term or the long term.
And can I just before we get into the sort of conversation about some of these cost of living issues, about skills and inflation and the whole mix, I did want to touch on one of the sort of politics issues, right? There are lots of people who are going to be running businesses, CBI members, who say, look, yes, you're right. They don't buy into the caricatured position of, uncontrolled immigration, but they also don't much like when they're dealing with higher input costs, when they're dealing with potentially higher tax bills, when they're dealing with higher energy prices, feeling as though they're getting it in the neck because they're quote unquote addicted to cheap labor and that they're part of the problem. And how do you articulate that to the government? How do you constructively get involved in that argument? Because some people will say this is an unreasonable demonization of business.
Yeah, let's be clear. Every business organization this week has been infuriated by the tone. I have had calls from members all week with exactly your point, James, which is really, we're doing this now. We're really doing this now. We're not rolling up our sleeves now to solve these problems, really. But look, it's peak politics. It's party conference season, right? Some people in the Conservative Party, Sonia will maybe help us understand this, wanted to try and create a little political argument here, which is this straw man of evil business that don't like paying people and love uncontrolled immigration. I've never met one of them. And the savior of the people who shall make the economy fairer once more. My own view is, let's stay out of that this week. Yeah, we're all a bit cross, given what's going on in our world, that's the government's response. All I would say is it's party conference week. Let's see where we are next Monday, and hopefully sense prevails.
All right. Well, let's try and make some sense then of. Can we start with high skills, high wage economy? Torsten and Sonia, I would love to know what you think of that proposition. Sonia, why don't you go first? I know when, for example, you were in the Treasury, there was endless discussion about fixing the productivity problem. So what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and there was endless conversation about fixing the productivity problem when George Osborne's team was there. So I think Torsten's tweeted about this quite often. It's not a new challenge, but actually I want to come back to the political because I think it's the guiding sort of factor for a lot of the decision making in the last week. And I think the biggest reflection I have firstly of both conferences is that they wanted to achieve quite a similar objective, which was about taking on their party rather than each other. And for Starmer, there were things around the structure of the party and preparing for an election. But for Boris Johnson, it's about kind of redefining the new centre and what sort of Johnsonism is, and sort of regaining discipline of his cabinet and really maintaining the focus on delivery for the next election. Because I worked for 3 prime ministers and each of them were very different, but this kind of this government is so driven by re-election and success, and business engagement is on the periphery of that. And your question was really a good one about how do you kind of articulate kind of your needs to government, and it's within that prism and using kind of the right sort of political language. I think one of the sort of risks that you're going to have in delivering this economy that really that surprised me at the conference was that there is a great sort of emergence of the libertarian wing of the Conservative Party, and just a lot of factionalism that will potentially derail the delivery of these events, because the conversation the Conservative Party haven't had is a very fundamental one, which is what is their economic approach. And I think you need to answer that before you talk about how to deliver kind of a high skill, high wage sort of economy. And there are people like Esther McVeigh and others who are part of the wing who are really pushing for kind of much less government intervention, a greater sense of kind of libertarian politics that they want, and it's all with the same goal and getting voters to sort of to vote for them essentially, and maintain the new people that they have on board. And so I think that's a risk that we're going to see in the next few months. And I guess for anyone who's listening, whether they're a small or large business, the biggest thing that I think the government will need is someone to just help them make the case for what they want and deal with all of these people who see that there is absolutely kind of no incentive for the government to step in. And I think that's why you get some of the language from Boris about if there are supply chain issues, you can deal with it as business. We're not going to intervene, because he's trying to placate two sides of his party, and it all becomes a bit jumbled and you get ambiguous messaging like you did kind of in and around COVID. So I think actually it's quite quite a difficult challenge, but I don't think you can get to fixing skills until you can get to working out and starting to redefine what your actual economic approach looks like. And I think that's what Rishi's speech tried to do, like very, very gently push kind of the party's economic policy into kind of a much more centrist approach, and start to create some distance between kind of the approach of chancellors going before him. So, and I think that's really important context for kind of understanding before we get to the delivery.
So, sorry, can we come back to Rishi Sunak's speech in a moment, because there is a kind of tax debt debate to be had. But let's just stick with, if we can, high skills, high wage. Torsten, can I put, there are basically two critiques of this. One is it's a bad idea, it's a ratchet for inflation and higher interest rates, or it's a good idea, but it won't work. There's no, you can't just will higher skills and higher wages. Is that the fair critique? How do you see it? What's the economic analysis of high skills, high wage?
So I think those two are both fair critiques. I think the unfair critique, but possibly the truer one, is that we're slightly over intellectualizing, and really Boris Johnson needed to write a column this week, and he's written a column. And you need to get through. You've got look in the end. What is one of the political geniuses of Boris Johnson, and there are many, is that he understands more than the entire Labour Party for the last kind of 20 years, and most of the Conservative Party, that you have to have an argument about the thing that is happening in the country here and now. You can't ignore what's actually going on. And the thing that's going on is rising prices and shortages. And Boris Johnson decided last week he was not going to go through this week without a big, loud argument about that, what that was. And the one that has offered itself is that you can helpfully have an argument about that stuff that combines two other things. One thing that is really important to him, and I think rightly so, which is that he's the guy that delivers on stuff the British public didn't think was going to happen, which is mainly Brexit, but a subset of that is lower migration. So he's got an argument about the shortages that reminds people that he's brought down migration, and does what he really cares about, which is being optimistic about the future, which is these things are going to lead to like sunny uplands in the future. And what he's got is the column. And as Tony said, that's what you should kind of expect out of a conference season. And then I think the exam questions are then for the country is there any nuggets within that of truth that tell you something important about where the country is going? So that gets to what I think I labeled the fair economic critiques of the discussion. So let's go through those in turn. So big picture, is it a good idea for Britain to renew its economic strategy and aim for a higher wage, higher productivity economic model? And the answer is yes. I don't think anybody in the whole country thinks that is the wrong answer. We're a country with, until quite recently, very high levels of low pay. We're a country with some sectors of our economy that are stuck or close to being stuck in low wage, low productivity business models. We have lower productivity than most other countries, in brackets, whether they have higher migration than us or lower migration than us. But we have lower productivity, and that is a serious problem. Business investment stagnated in the 4 years before the pandemic, and that's against a lower level than most other countries have seen. And our progress on human capital, we need human capital to be increasing all the time. It's one of the longer term drivers of growth in advanced economies, and that has brought, the pace of that increase has been slowing for at least 2 decades. So yes, the problem is the right one to be addressing. Migration and higher wages are higher wages is the outcome from what you want from that process. Migration is one small part of the policy kind of landscape that is central to achieving that. I'm less worried on your worries, James. I think the idea that wages are going to surge because the Prime Minister said they should, and therefore we'll have an inflation problem, is placing slightly too much of a 1970s flavour on the power of government. We don't actually have an incomes policy with some levers that could implement it. All we've got is a column. And so businesses aren't actually going to put up wages because the British Prime Minister told them to put up wages. They kind of slightly feel like they might be in control of their own destiny a bit more than that. I think the much bigger danger is that is both substantive danger and a political danger. The substantive danger is its prices going up, not wages. And the British public is about to spend the next, probably by Christmas, have its real wages actually falling, because prices will probably be rising faster than wages by Christmas. I mean, let's see, but probably for most people. And the political danger for the Prime Minister is he in retrospect sounds completely out of touch with a bunch of people that are seeing their energy bills going up, they're seeing their food prices rising, and some of them are finding it hard to get the things they want in the shops. And 4 million of them have just had their benefits cut by £1,000 a year. So that cost of living crunch could the tension between that as the reality and I've got a plan for your higher wages is not risk-free, even if it got you through you need to write a column for the week. And by the way, I'm a big fan of columns, so I don't want to say I love columns. Some of my best friends are columnists.
Torsten, I mean, I think there's sometimes a risk that you don't take the government or the Prime Minister at his word, because I think that it might well be the case that it starts out as a column and he thinks of it as a vision, and that's true.
That's completely right, James.
So can we just take it sort of seriously, and sort of pursue it?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is the relationship between a government that is arguing for higher wages, an economic set of circumstances where cost of living is increasing, so whether that's energy prices, whether that's the feed through on taxes, and therefore what happens in terms of prices translates into wages, translates into not just a blip in inflation, longer term inflation, and then not 1970s style inflation, but a multiple of the interest rate that we currently have? What's your outlook for that over the next 2 to 3 years?
Okay, so the first thing is uncertain. So I don't think anybody should be confident about what the macro outlook is for the next few years. And if we didn't learn that from the last 18 months, we should have learned it from the last decade, because no one thought most of the macro phenomena that we've been experiencing were the ones like very long-term low interest rates is not what everyone was expecting after the financial crisis. So I think uncertain, one. Two, I think so in a very uncertain world, the job of policymakers and businesses is you just got to attach probabilities to things and do your best to set policy. And I would place less weight on the idea that inflation is going to become entrenched via a good old-fashioned price wage back to prices spiral. And that is because I've got a number of reasons for that. One of that is theoretical, which is the British economy does not have mechanisms for that feedback loop to happen anymore. Okay, like there is an outside of the public sector and a handful of industrial sectors. There is no collective bargaining that works in that way. Okay, so it cannot happen. It cannot happen. That exact mechanism, price. Therefore, I demand higher wages. Therefore, I get higher wages, and that drives future prices. Cannot happen in the way it happened in the 70s. Empirically, we know that because we've had 2 experiences in the recent past of high inflation in the UK, which is the post-financial crisis, which went on for years and was much higher in terms of overall inflation than we're likely to see over the next year, with no feed through at all to nominal wages, and therefore very large falls in real wages. The problem was that it caused falls in real wages, not that it led to a price spiral. And exactly the same thing happened after the Brexit referendum. Sterling tanked, inflation went up, nominal wages did not respond, and real wages fell because of inflation. So both on the theory and the empirics, I wouldn't worry about it. That doesn't mean we should think, oh, there's definitely not going to be a longer period of inflation, with the point you're making, James, which is risks to interest rates. And that is because the drivers of inflation, which are demand being a bit stronger than maybe we feared, and the supply side of the economy being a complete disaster zone, are there, and they could last. And if they last, you could get inflation pressure continuing beyond the middle of next year, and the Bank of England will get nervous about that.
Tony.
Yeah, look, the one thing I just wanted to pick up from Torsten, which I don't think yet is in the has hit the desk of the economists, because I think the data's 6 weeks behind, is there is how to put it gently, serious pressure on wages, upward pressure in every sector of the economy. I haven't got that in macroeconomic acceptable data yet, but I have probably done, we've probably done 800 businesses in the last 6 weeks. Everybody is raising wages. And when you really dig it wide, there's a whole set of labor market issues, which is the labor market is hot as hell.
Yeah.
And there's 18 months worth of attrition that hasn't yet kicked in. There's a whole set of reasons why the labor market is very hot in every sector. What I don't know, Torsten will know better whether or not it's true at every level, but certainly from talking to businesses in the last weeks, it appears to me that at every level and in every sector, wages are already on the march, not really in response to prices, although that might be some of it, but in response to a whole set of labor market issues. Now, whether or not that leads to temporary or permanent, whether or not the causes and the outcomes are temporary or permanent, I don't know. But I bet you, as a shout out to everybody on the call who's watching, share your story about what you're dealing with on wages and prices. I spoke to a CFO of a very major high street chain yesterday, and they've already had the wage hike. And now their stores are all saying, what do we now do on prices? Presumably we're going up. So I think the data 6 weeks behind.
Do you hear anything on because I think I hear the same thing, businesses saying, come on, by the end of the year, if we're at 4% inflation or something even getting towards that, we're going to need to do something on wages. What in that mix, do you hear anything around the increase in the minimum wage and the response of business to that?
Yeah, I mean, let's see what the LPC do. But I mean, the interesting question is whether or not the LPC are going to have to, continue on their path, or whether or not they're catching up with the reality. I in many sectors, and Torsten may disagree with this, I'm not underrating some of the areas of serial low pay, but in many parts of the economy, people are already now moved to way above minimum wage in order to just find people. You just can't find people. So I think this is the labor market concerns, I think, are quite profound. What I don't know and can't say, Torsten may know better, is whether or not they're going to be permanent, or they are just, as the Prime Minister puts it, the central heating coming back on and that creating a bit of havoc.
All right, I want to, if I may, just go back to Rishi Sunak's speech, and if it's all right, Sonia, I wanted to talk to you about morality. So, according to the Chancellor, tax is more moral than debt, or increasing debt, as he put it, is immoral, right? And I just wondered whether you could give us some perspective on the politics of this, because there will be some Conservatives who say, no, a lower tax economy that enables enterprise is, they wouldn't say necessarily more moral, but probably better in terms of growth, wealth, employment, than a higher tax economy and keeping debt at 100%. Can you talk about the divisions within the Conservative Party on this, and even between the Treasury and the Conservative Party on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that line was a really interesting one, because I've seen it floated around for about the last 5 years, and I think it comes from polling that the sort of political team at the Treasury will do, and it's just a much more attractive proposition to the general public to argue that sort of if you think about kind of the impact on future generations, they just don't think that leading them with kind of debt is the right approach. And so I think that really is kind of one of the biggest drivers for a lot of the lines that we saw in Rishi's speech, which was much more about, I think, laying out his vision for the economy forward and bringing the party along with him, because ultimately that's what conferences are there to do, and that's who they're there to speak to, kind of rather than, I guess, any other group of people. So for me, it feels like this really plays into the discussion around sort of election preparation and laying the pathwork and the groundwork for that after moving from sort of emergency to emergency. But I actually think the truth is a very crass one, which is when you talk about tax and debt, tackling one is much more sort of easier to handle when talking to the public or writing a column, like Torsten argues, than the other.
And do you think, Sonia, that one of the comments you heard from Conservatives, from those low tax, sort of animal spirits enterprise Conservatives, has been that actually what's happened to Rishi Sunak is he's been captured by the Treasury. That the small c conservatism of the Treasury has meant that he's pushed through an increase in NICs and national insurance contributions, when actually some of that NHS social care funding could have been done through debt, and they've tripped into being a high taxation party because of that institutional conservatism of the Treasury. Is there any truth to that, or are we caricaturing everyone in this context?
No, I don't think there is. And the thing I find really interesting is if you talk to any chancellor, the very, very last thing that they want their legacy to be is always a debt issue rather than a taxation issue, rather than anything to do with their fiscal strategy. That's what is always at the back of their mind. And I think it's fascinating because for a long time, especially the short stint that I did with Boris Johnson, the economy wasn't even on the radar and nobody thought about tax and debt. So I think it's Rishi really gripping the department. I mean, ultimately the Treasury likes to be powerful, and it felt very comfortable when George was there. I think less so kind of after that. So I think this is Rishi setting up kind of where he wants to be, and it's interesting because he really plays to the Conservative Party audience. He is far more attached to the chancellors before him than Boris Johnson is to the prime ministers that came before him, when you have the discussion about sort of maintaining that legacy or getting rid of it. So no, I think it's sort of Rishi gripping the department, thinking about what he wants his legacy to be, thinking about kind of where sort of how much maybe headroom he will want if he became sort of prime minister, and what that gives him space to do. But yeah, that is the principal place where it comes from, which is Conservative chancellors feel very, very uncomfortable about what their legacy is going to be in laden future generations with debt, which I appreciate is not a very technical one, but I have seen that sort of in government, having worked for 3 prime ministers really, really consistently.
Which is a good reminder that you never get what you want in life, given that everybody's leaving higher debt. Literally every chancellor's left higher debts for like a long time. So like, congratulations to us.
Torsten, can I ask you though, what is a few minutes though on to making sense of the Labour position on this? Because I'm not clear. I'm going to ask Tony a bit about Labour and business, but just Labour and the economy. We're in the weird and wonderful world where the Conservatives have raised NICs. The Labour Party has said they're against that, which would suggest they're going to have to find a whole load of money from somewhere before they even get to the point of being able to make fresh investments. What does Rachel Reeves' economics look like?
So we obviously don't. I mean, I definitely don't know the answer to that in a kind of conclusive fashion. I think the job of opposition is obviously always a mixture of relative position setting versus a government, because the government gets to set an agenda much more comprehensively, and then elements where you want to try and make the weather. The thing that has happened to British politics in the last, since the beginning of September, is the big thing is obviously, as you say, the tax rises for social care and the NHS. And what that has done to British politics that probably, I say probably, but with uncertainty, lasts till the next election, is that the tax battleground is much more likely to be on a big row about which taxes go up and the fairness of those taxes, and not on a big difference in the level of those taxes. Because Boris Johnson's put up taxes by 1.6% of GDP. It's the biggest increase by any Conservative prime minister since at least the Second World War. The Labour Party isn't going to go into the election promising like, well, he's only just got started. We're going to do double that. They're going to instead, if they're got half a brain, have a row about fair taxation. And I have to say, the national insurance thing, I think, will end up being a mistake on that basis because it's just so easy to critique.
And Torsten, what's the demographics of this? Edward Morris has asked about young and old, under 30. So not just NICs, but also student loan repayments and cost of living. Can you sort of give us the map of how this plays out, young, I was going to say and old, but young versus old?
Yeah, we can do a bit of that. So if we go through some of these big elements, so the cuts to universal credit are particularly focused on what you might call early middle age. So basically, because families with kids are more likely to be on universal credit. The only caveat to that is that right now, because of COVID, more young people are on universal credit than normal. So you've got more 20-somethings on universal credit right now, but they're fast flowing off at the moment. So the steady state losers from a lower rate of universal credit is basically people in their 30s. They are disproportionate. Obviously, there's lots around the edges, but they're the groups that are most heavily represented by that cut to the benefit system. The price rises that you're seeing and both from energy and food are pretty broad based. So I'd say you can see a clear pattern, which is their bigger shares of expenditure for poor households, but by age, everybody spends money on those things. So I wouldn't overdo the age distribution of those changes. The bigger age issue is obviously just down to work, which is like, young people work and pay national insurance, and pensioners don't pay national insurance because the government didn't extend the new health and care levy to pension income, or for that matter, landlord's income and the rest. And it's that the national insurance thing is therefore uneven by age, although I'd say it's really about the working age population versus the not working, rather than about the young versus the middle age, or whatever we want to call 50-year-olds these days.
Well, Tony, comes to Labour and business, did you think there was a change that was substantive or tonal or neither?
No, both actually. I mean, I think. Look, I think Torsten's right that the Labour Party politics, I think, run like this. Labour wants to restore its reputation for economic competence, and in so doing, a better relationship with business is a proxy for that, right? And I think Rachel did a brilliant job of identifying the most unpopular business tax in the country, which is business rates. And business rates, we've talked about it before. I will be talking to the Chancellor about it. It is literally probably the worst business tax in the country for a whole kind of reasons. It's anti-investment, it's anti-green, it's the highest amongst major competitors, and it's deeply unpopular for small and large businesses alike. And so I think Rachel has hit a nerve in targeting that. But I think the bigger politics of the Labour Party are, they had a huge package of measures at their conference also on employment rights, on the low paid, and I think that the way they pay for them are through personal wealth taxes rather than business taxes. And so, as Torsten calls it, fairer taxation. And so I think we're in a slightly curious position where the Labour Party are looking sort of better on business taxes, but higher on wealth taxes than the Conservative Party. And look, the CBI has no position on personal taxes. It's literally none of our business. But I think, we would definitely welcome what Rachel did.
That's definitely not been the historical position, Tony. That's a very impressive. You're like a priest with a self-denying ordinance at this. The CBI is never going to have a position on personal taxation.
I really like the accusation of being a priest. You're literally the first that has ever.
I'm just remembering previous lives with previous CBI Director Generals ringing me up with very strong positions on rates of personal taxation.
Torsten, where they conflate, of course, is where when it comes to individual entrepreneurs, right? So individual entrepreneurs, personal tax, business tax, they can be the same thing. So that will get pretty interesting. Okay. But look, we don't, I don't know about my predecessors. I don't think we should be having a view about individual taxation. I think the crisis we have at the minute, if I might say, is that every single part of business taxation seems to be going up. I'm not sure that's a very good plan for growth.
Can we, in the last few minutes, I just wanted to ask each of you a question about, let's call it the pigs in blankets problem, right? What do you do if you are coming towards, you're going into 3 months where it's very possible the fuel shortage is not the last shortage, that you're going to see other labour shortages, and then you're going to see other areas of empty shelves of supply shortages. And I ask this because Andrew Campling had put this question in the chat, which was, does the Prime Minister's stance on labour shortages suggest that he is trying to distance the government from the impending problems through the winter, positioning them as the fault of business rather than politicians or Brexit? I.e., is business going to keep on being on the end of this particular set of problems? What do you think? I'm not Sonia and Torsten, I'm going to give you the last word if I might, Tony. Sonia, what do you think? Do you think we've set up a pattern for the next 3 months where, when there are shortages, politicians get on air and turn on business? Do you think that's what it looks like?
I think so to an extent, but I also think businesses are collateral damage, and the fact that kind of like the PM's speech this week, there's just no sense of prioritization, and there are so many big things happening at the end of this year, whether that's COP26, whether that's dealing with kind of the emergency in front of you, that I get the sense that there just isn't bandwidth to deal with it alone. So it's sort of the easiest thing is to place that burden on your shoulders and say, here you are, why don't you fix this for us? Because we either don't have the skills or the capacity to kind of do that in-house. And there have been much bigger business teams at Number 10 in the past, as you will know, and that has been quite helpful in fostering sort of good relationships, but also in seeing businesses as an ally. Whereas the feedback I get from people who I know in government, whether at Number 10 or Number 11, is always, we feel like businesses come to us with problems, not solutions, and we don't always have the answers, which is why actually when joint working has happened on the COVID business loan schemes, it's been quite successful, but I think sometimes the success of those schemes is quite easily forgotten, and as a result, we go back to I guess the relationships that existed kind of much closer to 2019 than 2021. So I think in essence, yes, I don't think it is so I don't think it comes from as much of a bad place as it did kind of a few years ago. I think it's reflective of sort of the experience in government and the resourcing in government.
Torsten?
So I think I wouldn't expect the exact framing from this week to last, because the column that was required in the rest of the autumn is different for the column for this week, which is we're not going to get the extreme version of the fuel crisis shortages. It won't last through the autumn, and most other shortages are not as politically traumatic as that. As in, fuel shortages. I don't know why I keep saying protests. I've obviously got some kind of. I'm not starting a protest, I promise. Fuel shortages plus energy bills are like, for the given increasing costs, are like totemic political problems that, like the last 30 years has told us, cause government's problems. The much more likely column that will need writing through the rest of the autumn is, it's a bumpy ride. Turning the economy back on after the pandemic leads to these stresses or strains, be it pigs on blankets or other less high profile shortages. And that will be based. So I think the column that Rishi Sunak wrote this week in his speech is more likely to become the government's overall tone through the autumn. The exception to that is, I think the government is going to be stressed on energy prices, because they're going to go, where the rubber's going to hit the road here is energy. The rest of it is small fry. I mean, there's a bit of consumer nonsense about pigs in blankets, but basically it's energy that's the problem. And I think there the government will need to it's either going to have its column with a last paragraph with some more action, so more help on bills, or someone's going to have to be to blame.
Right, totally.
I think both are right. The thing that I've got my mind on more is that we were supposed to be bouncing back to a high growth, high productivity economy. We've got some real challenges at the moment. Most of our members have moved from a sort of August ambition to a bit of September dampened spirit. And it's our job to support members in trying to overcome these short-term challenges and get the economy moving again. And I hope that Torsten is right, that actually government will see their role as being our partner in that, rather than the rather opposite tone that we heard this week.
Tony, thank you very much. Sonia and Torsten, thank you too. We get together, by the way, we're looking away from sort of short-term politics to really long-term change next Wednesday. CBI at 10, we're talking COP26 to people who've actually been in the room in previous COP, so what will happen and what that will mean for business. Thank you each for your time this morning. Thanks everyone for joining us, and have a very good rest of your day. Thanks all.